73 million dead. That was the final death toll of World War II. But everything could have been different because of a 30-second decision that changed history forever. On December 7, 1941, a single, timely radio message averted the greatest disaster in American naval history. And with that, it changed the fate of the entire planet. Without Pearl Harbor, Hitler conquered Europe. Japan dominated Asia. The United States isolated itself. And the world you know today simply never existed. This is the story of how 30 seconds of difference created an entirely different planet, where the Nazis won, where America never became a superpower, and where millions of lives took paths you never imagined. Let's rewind to the exact moment where everything could have changed. It was November 26, 1941. A Japanese fleet of 33 ships was secretly sailing toward Hawaii. Aboard the aircraft carrier Akagi, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida was reviewing the charts. For the last time, his 183 aircraft were ready for the most audacious attack in naval history. But in our alternate history, something happened that no one expected. An American destroyer, the USS Ward, was patrolling the waters near Pearl Harbor when it detected something strange on its sonar. It was the Japanese Maid submarine Ha-19, but this time, instead of sinking it as happened in reality, the Ward's captain decided to follow it without attacking. The Japanese submarine unwittingly guided the Ward directly toward the Japanese attack fleet. On the afternoon of December 6th, the Ward managed to send an urgent radio signal. Enemy fleet sighted 200 miles north of Oahu, over 30 ships, requesting immediate reinforcements. This time, the message was not lost in the military bureaucracy. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander of the Pacific Fleet, received the alert and acted immediately. Within hours, Pearl Harbor was transformed into a battle-ready fortress. Ships dispersed, planes went on high alert, and anti-aircraft defenses were activated. When Japanese planes arrived at Pearl Harbor on December 7th at 7:55 a.m., they didn't find unsuspecting ships sleeping in the harbor. Instead, they encountered a naval base fully alert and ready to fight. American P-40 Warhawk fighters were already in the air, waiting for them. The battle was fierce but brief. Without the element of surprise, the Japanese were unable to cause the devastating damage they had planned. After 2 hours of intense combat, they were forced to withdraw. They had lost more than half of their planes and had failed to sink a single American battleship. This is where the story takes a completely different turn. Without the success of Pearl Harbor, Japanese Emperor Hirohito began to doubt his government's strategy. The Japanese military, led by General Hideki Tojo, had promised a swift and decisive victory. Instead, they suffered a humiliating defeat in Tokyo, the streets filled with protests. The Japanese people, who had been convinced their army was invincible, now questioned the war. Families who had lost children in the failed attack demanded answers. The pressure on the emperor became unbearable. Meanwhile, in the United States, the reaction was completely different. Instead of the anger and desire for revenge that followed the real Pearl Harbor, Americans took pride in having repelled the attack. But this early victory had an unexpected consequence. Many Americans felt they did not need to fully enter the war. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt found himself in a difficult position. Although Japan had attacked American soil, the attack had failed. Many members of Congress argued that the United States had demonstrated its strength and should now focus on defending itself, not conquering the Pacific. In Europe, Adolf Hitler watched these events with great interest. In reality, Hitler had declared war on the United States days after Pearl Harbor, a massive strategic mistake. But in our alternate history, with the United States less involved, in the Pacific, Hitler decided not to provoke the Americans. Without an all-out war against the United States, Hitler was able to concentrate all his forces on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. By the summer of 1942, German troops had captured Moscow. A desperate Stalin appealed to the Allies for help, but without massive American support, the response was limited. While Europe was bleeding, a very different war was unfolding in the Pacific. Without the impetus of the successful Pearl Harbor, Japan could not expand so rapidly. The Philippines, which actually fell to the Japanese in May 1942, held out for much longer with limited but steady U.S. support. General Douglas MacArthur, rather than being evacuated from the Philippines, managed to organize an effective defense. With supplies arriving occasionally from Australia and Hawaii, U.S. and Filipino forces maintained a tenacious resistance that lasted until 1943. But perhaps the most dramatic change occurred in China. In reality, Japan had concentrated most of its forces on conquering the Pacific after Pearl Harbor. In our alternate history, without these rapid conquests, Japan kept more troops in China. To try to end the 4-year-old war, Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the Chinese nationalist government, received more support from the United States via the Burma route. But more importantly, the Chinese communists, led by Mao Zedong, decided to cooperate more actively with the nationalists against their common enemy, Japan. By 1943, the world was divided very differently. In Europe, Nazi Germany controlled most of the continent, including Moscow and much of Western Russia. In Asia, Japan was mired in a brutal war in China and had lost the momentum to expand across the Pacific. The United States found itself in a strange position. It was technically at war with Japan, but was only fighting limited battles in the Pacific. With Europe under German control and Russia defeated, many Americans began to think it might be time to negotiate a peace. In the 1944 election, Lindbergh challenged Roosevelt as the presidential candidate of a coalition of disaffected Republicans and Democrats. His message was simple: America has proven it can defend itself. Now it is time to let Asia and Europe solve their own problems. The 1944 election campaign was one of the most intense in American history. Roosevelt argued that the United States had a moral responsibility to defeat fascism and militarism. Lindbergh countered that the United States had a responsibility to take care of its own citizens first. The result was incredibly close, but Lindbergh won by a narrow margin. His victory marked a definitive turning point in world history. In his inaugural address in January 1945, Lindbergh announced that the United States would seek peace with Japan and focus on strengthening the defenses of the Western Hemisphere. Peace negotiations between the United States and Japan began in Honolulu in March 1945. Without the pressure of total war in the Pacific, both countries were willing to reach an agreement. Japan agreed to withdraw from the Philippines and respect the neutrality of Pacific Islands under American control. In exchange, the United States recognized Japan's co-prosperity sphere in East Asia, including its control over Korea, Manchuria, and much of China. It was an agreement that would have been unthinkable in reality, but in this alternate world, it seemed the only way to avoid years more of bloody war. Meanwhile, in Europe, things took an even darker turn. Without the threat of a massive American invasion, Hitler consolidated his control over Western and Eastern Europe. By mid-1945, the last Soviet forces had been defeated in the Urals, and Stalin had fled to Siberia. Great Britain, completely isolated and without hope of American support, finally accepted Hitler's peace offers in August 1945. Winston Churchill was forced to resign, and a new British government signed a treaty that made England a virtually neutral state, but under German influence. By the end of 1945, the world looked radically different. Europe was under German control from the Atlantic to the Urals. East Asia was dominated by Japan. The United States controlled the Americas and maintained a strong presence in the Central Pacific, but had abandoned its claim to being a global world power. Technology also developed differently. Without the urgency of total war, the American Manhattan Project advanced more slowly. Germany, with all of Europe's resources at its disposal, succeeded in developing nuclear weapons first, testing its first atomic bomb in October 1945. The following years brought a cold peace, very different from the Cold War we know. Instead of the United States versus the Soviet Union, the world was divided between three superpowers: Nazi Germany controlling Europe and Africa, the Japanese Empire dominating Asia, and the United States leading the Americas. Each power developed its own sphere of influence and its own economic system. Trade between the three spheres was limited, and each tried to be completely self-sufficient. It was a world of closed borders and rival systems. But the question that arises is, would this world have been better or worse than the one we know? On the one hand, millions of lives would have been saved. Without the widespread Holocaust that resulted from the German victory in Europe, but also, without the liberation of the concentration camps, the fate of European Jews would have been different, though probably not better. In Asia, without the total war in the Pacific, millions of Chinese, Filipino, and other civilians would not have died. But under permanent Japanese rule, these peoples would never have achieved independence and self-determination. The United States, for its part, would have developed very differently. Without becoming a global superpower, it would have maintained a lower profile in world affairs. This might have meant fewer international conflicts, but also less progress in civil rights and technology, which were driven by Cold War competition. The space race would never have happened in the same way. Without direct competition with the Soviet Union, and with Germany focused on consolidating its control of the Earth, space exploration would have advanced much more slowly. Perhaps the most fascinating thing about this alternate history is how a single event could have altered the course of all human civilization. Lieutenant William W. Outerbridge of the USS Ward, the American destroyer, had decided to pursue rather than attack the early warning that worked this time. The Battle of Pearl Harbor, which ended in American victory rather than defeat. These small changes created a domino effect that completely transformed the 20th century. It reminds us that history is not inevitable. It is full of moments where a different decision could have changed everything. Of course, this is just one of many ways history could have been different. Perhaps without Pearl Harbor, the United States would have found another reason to fully enter the war. Or perhaps nuclear technology would have developed more quickly, ending the war in an even more dramatic way. What we do know is that the world we live in was shaped by those critical moments, where history took one path instead of another. And sometimes it all comes down to something as simple as a radio message that arrives on time, or a commander who makes the right decision at the right moment. That the story you just heard teaches us that nothing in the past was inevitable, and that the future isn't either. Every day we make decisions that could change the course of history. The question is, what decisions are you making that could change the world? If you like this fictional story of what would happen if we would, appreciate a like, let us know your opinion in the comments, and subscribe.